I have a little bit different perspective than some of the other speakers here. Just a quick background on myself. I've been in corporate and investment banking since '96, mainly in agriculture and commodities. And in the last 15 years, we've seen a lot of move by banks, investment banks, traders to improve sustainability. But there are a few issues why sustainability is not always moving that fast, or why we focus so much on palm oil. Because if tomorrow I would cut down a rainforest for rubber, we would not be sitting here. So because I'm planting palm oil on that land, I have all the NGOs and all the stakeholders coming after me. So it's quite sometimes interesting to see that everybody's focused on palm oil. There's so many other commodities in this region which are produced very unsustainable. I can drive down South Kalimantan to a plantation which is being argued about sustainability issues. I will drive past by Edgare, which is an open coal pit mine. Nobody complains in Europe about coal coming from Indonesia. It's more destructive than any palm oil plantation I've seen. So it's quite interesting to hear all these opinions about how sustainable palm oil should be. I think we have a lot of other commodities that we should look at. Just a bit background who we are. We are a private firm, makes it easier to work in the palm oil sector. No shareholders. So what we do is we are a typical corporate finance firm. We help companies in commodity markets and renewables to do M&A, debt equity raising. We focus very much on palm oil. We do that in a couple of countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Papua New Guinea. I think that at this moment in the palm oil sector, there is an enormous rush for expansion. The moratorium that is taken, that's going to take place in Indonesia, has put a rush on companies to expand. We know that potentially by the end of the year in PNG there's a moratorium for new licenses. So we see a lot of interest by companies to look at new land. And unfortunately for all the discussion we have about sustainability, palm oil is one of the most profitable crops you can have. If I would have one piece of land in Indonesia, I would plant palm oil, because it has the highest yields, the most profits. So sometimes you have to look back. Why are all these companies expanding, whether it's sustainable or unsustainable? It's because the profits are so high. At this moment, a couple of years ago, the price were up to $1,200, $1,300. These plantation companies, whether they're listed like Wilmar or private families, make a lot of money. And as long as people make money, they will invest and expand. So we have to see, why is the reason why this sector is still growing so fast? But a little bit on the banking, from the banking perspective, the core banking. In this part of the world, I think the palm oil sector, soft commodity sector, is very important for the regional banking sector. We maybe sometimes deny, but a large part of Singapore was built on Indonesian money, and a large part of that money came from the plantation sector. So we're all a bit guilty. If you then look at sustainability in the banking sector, and I'm talking about my experience since in '96, I worked for a Dutch bank called Rabobank, very much focused on agriculture. I think they were one of the initiators of the RSPO, even before the name RSPO was put in play. In the last, say, 15 years, I think banks have very much focused both operationally, internally, to increase their sustainability, lower their own greenhouse gas balances, but also external focus. And external focus, I think, is the most important for us today to discuss, is that it's for a bank very difficult to see a client which is very profitable, which almost guarantees him a return and a guaranteed payback, but while his stakeholders are saying, no, you cannot finance that client. So what I see is that sometimes very forcefully, or banks are trying to excuse themselves not to finance or to finance a palm oil company. And I was sitting at a large bank a couple of months ago talking about a project. And I was sitting with the head of credit, and he says, well, we would love to do this client, but there were some members of a NGO in Europe in front of our head office, and I got a call at night to explain why we were financing a certain client. So he is a bit in the middle, saying, no, I like this client, I like this sector. I know Indonesia, is built partly on soft commodities, but my head office is saying you can't do that. So I think that some of the banks are trying to find a midway and trying to set up sustainability criteria. Companies like IFC were one of the first to put up sustainability criteria. Standard Chartered, HSBC. But one thing we have to avoid is we should not become too radical towards those financial stakeholders, because what you see is that if they don't finance, there will be other people financing it, and you will not have control over what's happening in the market, in the sector. I mean, palm oil at the end of the day doesn't need financing. There are a lot of people out there that are willing to put money in it without the need for a bank. But I think that if I see of all the commodities that I've worked in, which rubber, cocoa, I think palm oil has seen the most improvement in sustainability, and we are still, of course, talking about it. But I was in PNG. I go to PNG almost every month, and I went to a new Britain palm oil estate. And these people don't have running water, they still wash themselves in the river. But outside that compound of workers, there are 3 different garbage bags. One is for food waste, which they don't have because they eat everything, not like us. Plastics and something else. These people are doing this because New Britain palm oil is ISO 14002 and thus now RSPO certified. So segregation of waste. Because somebody in head office in London says, I only want to buy your palm oil when it's sustainable. I live in a affluent street here in Singapore. I have 1 black rubbish bin and everything goes in there and I don't really care about it. So, I mean, palm oil I think is one of the most sustainable sectors you can now invest in. But what are the key drivers for sustainability in the banking sector? Well, of course, lenders' liability. It's never good to have a few fake orang-utans in front of your head office in London. So that's a big liability for banks. And although the money is good and the clients are good, I think some of the banks have significantly reduced their exposure to financing palm oil plantations. Of course, borrowers' ability to meet financial obligations. We have not seen it yet, but some of the palm oil plantations are grown on areas which potentially could be taken back by the government, meaning there is a financial loss. That means that banks will have a financial liability with that client. Growing environmental concerns, of course, they see all the stakeholders, communities talking about the issues playing. But I think that some of the banks also use this as a opportunity to look at new areas to grow. And of course, there's more on the renewable energy side. If you see at a plantation is actually a small power generation capacity. So in a plantation, you can build a biomass power plant, you can build a biogas power plant. Every palm oil mill is around 10 megawatt. There you have a business opportunity and you're reducing greenhouse gas balance. So a lot of banks are looking at alternative ways. Let's be more on the banking side. Just give you a quick overview what I see who are the financial stakeholders, and quite a number of them. I mean, today we're talking about the public shareholders and then especially the institutional investors, the pension funds who are very concerned about what's happening in the plantation sector. Same as the banks, the core banks. I mean, we see a lot of trade finance. There's a lot of palm oil being exported, the largest vegetable oil exported in the world. But one of the other areas that we should be careful with are the private shareholders. So if we put on too much pressure on all the public shareholders, companies will just go private. I mean, one of my contacts or one of the companies that we sometimes talk and work with, Cinemas, I mean, at one point in time, if you start hitting them too hard, they will go private. They don't really care, and they will get fed up, and they will go private, and then you don't have influence over what they're doing so much anymore. So you have to be reasonable and rational, I think, in these discussions. Just some quick milestones. I think a lot has been done in the banking sector, and especially because of the pressure coming from Europe. I think in 97, 98, I was working in a bank, and there was a report by a Dutch NGO describing every single lending product that the banks were putting into the palm oil sector. It was quite scary. It was almost that somebody in the bank went in there and just stole the files. That set off quite a big debate in Europe and also with the banks to start improving the sustainability and look at more environmental credit scores. Well, in 2002, some of the Dutch banks, especially the Dutch banks, I think were a bit targeted. I mean, some of the NGOs have a big presence in the Netherlands, and we are very vocal. I'm Dutch. So the Dutch banks were, I think, one of the first movers in this area. And they started to look at restricting financing for oil palm development. And of course, in August 2003, we had the inaugural meeting of RSPO, and some of the banks were part of that process to implement, because they had to find a platform to work on. What we saw last year, and that was more IFC, who always had been, I think, one of the front runners. They even stopped further lending until they had a very good policy in place. So I think as a conclusion for palm oil, it's quite an interesting sector to look at, because everybody is very concerned about the environmental concerns, but it's also one of the sectors that's the most profitable in the region. So we have a balance between should we make money or should we try to manage the environment. And I think that as long, and that's my main concern, as long as we in Europe want to increase our food habits, as long as China, India will increase their consumption, there will be palm oil. PNG and palm oil and PNG can only be grown if you cut down a rainforest. If we want to have a new door, it comes out of PNG. So I think we sometimes should be a bit more reasonable and look at ourselves if we want to improve the sustainability in this sector, and not always blame the plantation companies, because I think they're doing quite a lot of work, and especially Wilmar, but some of the other listed companies are doing a lot of work to improve it. But we sometimes should look at ourselves as a consumer of all these products.